I think it's for me, there's 2 points here. Like one is in this case, look, you want should proprietary software exist? Even like a completely proprietary? Yes, of course. Should we allow people for shades of gray? Yes, right. But the open source, right, was created as something very specific, right? And I don't think that is a good idea to let people to attempt to redefine that, right, which does not really meet the criteria of open source anymore. And what is most important, also does not provide their value to the consumers, right, what you would expect in open source.
So once again, we're here with our good friend Peter Zaitsev. Yes. Avi and I are here to chat with him. And, Peter, we are at the State of OpenCon 2023. What are your thoughts so far?
Well, I think that is great. I think it's fantastic what Amanda and Open UK started this event. I think it's especially interesting coming here from PostDem, right? As you can see, this is kind of a lot different vibe, right? Like
their very much different vibe.
Yeah. Their PostDem is all about geeks, right? This one is like all more about, I think, their policy and legal side of open source and so on, which I frankly don't always appreciate that much, but we do need it. Right? Because if that's not taken care of, well, then you can get into, a lot of trouble.
Yes, obviously. But obviously.
Yeah, it's kind of, I feel like, FOSDEM being on kind of one end where it's just really, developers, geeks, hackers, and then you have these conferences like, the KubeCons where it's very, every single vendor in that space, and it's really, a lot of booth hopping, these kinds of things, and this is somewhere in between those, maybe slightly on a different axis though, a little bit.
Well, yeah, I think in this case, if you think about that, right, like a KubeCon, right, it's specifically focused on like one dimension on their open source technology, right? Like this one doesn't particularly has any specific open source in mind, and I think that's interesting, right? Because often as spend in your time in open source, like an infrastructure side, you may not, appreciate how much other stuff surrounding open source is happening out there.
Yeah, definitely. So, out of curiosity, when you go to conferences, what are the sort of things you're looking for to pick a conference to go to?
Well, I think for me, it is not so much about attending for like education anymore, right? Frankly, I prefer in this case to look through the slides, right, and maybe watch recording, right, and if I have like questions, right, I will just contact the speaker, right, and usually talk to him if I need to, right? But what so for me it is important to see the relevant crowd, people which care about what I have to say, right? Because it's not fun when you come to a conference, right, and then you see there's like 10 people in the room, right, and they just on their phones because we just don't give a shit, right? What you're
they're using your room as the work room.
Yeah, so that is so that is something which is important for me, right? But it's also I would say in many cases the quality of attendees and especially speakers, right? I think that's a hallway track is very important for me, and often like a biggest takeaway would be this kind of unplanned side of conference, saying, "Oh, I had a great conversation with those, couple of people, and we are going to do some cool things here."
Okay, fair enough.
So I guess when you were much more in the thick of running Percona, how did you think about how much time you were spending going to conferences? Because like it's very, very time consuming, very, can really distract you from like the day to day of running the business. How did you?
Yes, yeah. Well, I think the good thing and bad thing, right? In the early days when I started Percona, right, and that was in 2006. Their conference in the space were not really so overwhelming, right? Because right now, I think the industry has grown and folks figure out that conferences are the good thing to kind of spread the word, right? To meet with your community and so on. So there is like often multiple conferences happening every week. Right? So you can't hit them all, right? In that old days, right? Well, really, there was not as many of them, right?
Yeah.
So you often could hit all the relevant conference in the ecosystem much easier.
Yeah, because really back then it was like the OSCON, MySQL conference. I don't even know if there really was more than just a couple Postgres meetups, right, from the database space.
Yeah, but at Percona at that time also did not really focus on Postgres, right?
So it was a much narrower.
So that was much more narrow.
Yeah, but now, I mean, with open source blowed up, so every conference now seems to have some sort of open source track or something on it.
We were looking at our 2023 calendar for conferences this year, and like we could be traveling like every other week if we really wanted to hit every single conference and just like completely.
That has become very very different, right? And I think it's also interesting to me is what there is, I think, a lot more like conference fatigue for many folks, right? Especially if you think about speaker thought leaders, right? It's kind of, hey, you know what, I go to many of them, right? It's kind of different, right? Compared to if you have like, well, everybody who is part of this ecosystem, right? They all get together on that event once in a year, right? And you have a different level of energy out there.
Very true. Okay, I guess here's actually a question that could be for both of you, because you've both been doing conferences for a lot longer than me, giving lots of talks. Peter, you gave 6 talks at Boston.
Seven talks, right?
Yeah, including pre-post the MySQL David.
Okay, 7 talks.
Yeah.
What's your advice to people who are kind of just getting into this? Maybe they've submitted a couple talks and they were all gotten rejected, which I think is very common. There's a lot of people who will try to give talks in a given conference, me included. Yeah. What's your advice for me to have a higher acceptance rate at talks at conferences?
Well, so look, right, the first thing I would say, right, it was a surprise for me that with they accepted so many of my talks, right, and I even say what that is unfair. I think there have been some other good talks which were rejected, right, in this case, right, but I think a lot of my talks also were mostly at the different tracks.
Like one per track or something.
Yeah, so that is something which also think like why it was this way, right? And also I would say it's not always this case, right? There are some conferences where I don't get accepted, right? I think you should not take your rejections, personally. My advice would be in this case is to start building your portfolio, right? Maybe you can speak at the local events, local meetups, maybe some webinars, right? Because in many cases you get that recognition, right? Or if you supply like here, listen for me to me speak, that can help, right? I also think it's and that is what I was saying about the speakers. Actually, having their name recognitions with the people who are on those committees and who decide, that is very important, right? So attend those events, right? Know who is on committee, right? And just open chat to them.
Yeah. Very, very relationship based, right?
Very relationship based.
Yeah, and you don't want to have bias completely to say like, oh, I'm only going to bring in the people that I know or my friends, when you're on a CFP committee. But it does help if there's 2 sessions and you're like, I know this is a known quantity. I know they want to speak. they're eager to be here and this other person isn't. But I think there's also some other strategies. Now, Peter, I know you do this. I know I do this. I know Bruce Bruce from the Postgres community.
Yeah.
Bruce from the Postgres community. I just knocked my mic off. Also does this where we submit lots of different talks to each of the conferences because we don't know exactly what they're looking for sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes, having more of a bit of a blanket approach. Now, some organizers don't like that because there's just too many coming in. But if there's multiple tracks and you have things that fit into multiple tracks, that can really work well, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's one option that you can do as well.
Well, and I think there's another interesting thing here, right? I would say it's good to understand if you look at the conference, right? And especially if you had something like even vendor conference, right? Or even communities, they often have an angle, a focus, right? Of a conference as a whole of that year.
Mm-hmm.
If you can have something which supports that, that is a little more likely to be accepted. In certain cases, right, if you know who runs the company, right, I think it's also maybe good to ask, hey, you know what? What would you want to talk about, right? Maybe something, hey, what you sometimes, and we run Percona Live, right, for many years, right? Sometimes you can say, there's a lot of talks about this, but there is one topic you would like to be highlighted. There is not a lot of submissions, right? So saying, hey, you know what? Let me know. Right, and what the gaps are, right, and maybe say, hey, you know what, you let me know closer to the end of your CFP, right, because I'm looking to help you to cover the gaps, all right, and I think that especially help maybe down the road, right, when you have some reputation, right, in this case where you have that kind of say, hey, I can actually talk in a variety of angles, right, because if you are right.
Yeah. Well, and so another interesting thing is I think that it depends on the conference you're going to, because a lot of conferences, like FOSDEM, for instance, they're going to avoid anything that smells like a sales pitch, right? They don't want anything that's going to be promoting a specific project or product specifically, where it's just more of that salesy type mentality. And then when you do have something that's very product specific, a lot of the bigger companies or events typically want you to pay for that, right? They want you to sponsor and get sponsored talks. And so it's hard to sometimes navigate if you've got something where you really want to talk about your product and it's something that you sell, that typically is a more difficult position in my experience.
Well, that's right. And in this regard, even when it comes to your open source project, right? I would say on a smaller scale, right? If you're speaking about, hey, you know what, we're going to a Rust conference, right? And everybody's talking about Rust out there. Of course, you're going to talk about Rust, right? But if it's a smaller niche project, right? Even if it's open source, in many cases, it's better to talk about the problem, right? And then use your project as an example of a problem a solution, which is much more acceptable, right? And one thing I often talk to folks submitting to Percona Live in this case, saying, look, you want to talk about your tool, include it, great, right? But what I want is to make sure if somebody comes to your talk and they're never ever going to use your talk, they still get the value from it, right? And in many cases, you can say, well, talk about the problems, right, and wherever, right, and say, hey, in our tool we solve X, Y, and Z. That's fantastic, right? But that also helps the people just to understand their problem set, right? And yeah,
a lot of good helpful advice here. I will be enacting some of it.
So, okay, big topic. The reason that you're here, or that we wanted to have you here, not that we don't like to have you here. Well, actually, there's two things. Let's start with the first, just so we can make sure we don't run out of time again. You've started Open Source Underdogs.
No, Open Source Underdogs it's a podcast.
No. Okay, hold on.
That's the podcast name.
So let me start that over again. You started the Open Source Renegades.
No, I have started Renegade Underdogs.
Oh gosh.
It's very confusing. Okay, so
rewind.
Rewind.
Yeah.
You started Underdog Renegade. Renegade Underdogs. Renegade Underdogs?
Renegade Underdogs.
Renegade Underdogs. It's a mouthful. Tell us about it.
Well, yes, yes, it is a mouthful, right? And it is kind of exactly kind of intentional, right? Like a small company. I'm not looking to put that as a product name, right? Which is actually their umbrella company, right? Which gets us to build the various tools, right, to do activities, right, which are non-Percona related, right? And frankly, that will be yet to see in what comes out of that, right? I think I have many ideas, right, which is probably like too many, as many people in Percona management until I will tell you. So we'll see. So I've been consulting with some open source companies, helping them.
Okay.
Right. And with that, I would say maybe I'll be kind of more specific in this case, right? Where I think where I can be helpful is really helping gifted technologists, right, to have a product more ready for real world, right? Because I think a lot of engineers and a lot of this kind of a deep open source infrastructure project, they are built by the brilliant engineers, right? But they often do not recognize what they are fraction of that 1%, right? And if you want to scale your product, right, you need to figure out how to make things digestible, right, easy to use, right, and whatever for other people, right? And often they'll say, like, it's even some basic things like, well, you know what, how am I going to ship a product? Well, it's just, you check out things from a GitHub, you compile it, like you follow this process, look, it's working. Well, they don't really understand what that is, not something what most of the people will be ready to use, right? So there is a lot of I think opportunity in helping those entrepreneurs, right, or potential entrepreneurs, right, to create the value, right, and in my opinion.
I think the number one issue that I see with most startups founders and the early technologists is they think everyone is like them, right? They're solving a problem that they have, which is great, but they assume that everyone thinks the same way that they do about that problem and wants it solved the same way. So that means that if they're comfortable with a 37-step process to do it, they'll follow a 37-step process to do it.
Well, that's right. And I think from my side, I think I'm in a good position to help with that because I'm a weirdo, right? But I learned, right, for last, 20 years, right, if you will, right, to understand their normal human beings a little bit better.
Yeah, fair enough. And so with that, what's the most common question people come to you with? Like off the bat, you're talking to someone, what's probably the number one question you get?
Well, I think if you look at this case, right, one, the question is, of course, is a growth, right? Because in a lot of cases, people say, well, I've built this technology, which is, like a super cool, it can do XYZ things better than other technologies exist on the market, right? But, nobody's using it, right? Well, why is that, right? And how to make them use it, right? And I think that is, to me, that is also goes into some of what you look at their kind of success marketing, right? Which we hear in the ecosystem, right? Which looks like this kind of like an overnight successes, right? Oh, I built this thing, right? And it was so awesome. I have 1 million people download it, and then success happened, right? But it's often not like that at all, right? I mean, you have like a lot of steps kind of skipped out there.
Yeah, I think a lot of people look at that and they want to be that next fill in the blank overnight success, and they don't realize that there's so many companies that struggle with it for a long time before it clicks, if it ever does.
Well, yeah, and you know what? Like I like an analogy I heard somewhere from this regard, right? Is this is like a concept of a chicken, right? Because if you think for like an observer, you have an egg,
Yeah.
right? And then one day, right, you have a magic chicken appears of it, right? But if you look that from a chicken standpoint, right, there is a lot of slow and invisible growth, right? How your egg converts into chicken, right? Right, in this case. And I think that is what often happens with those like overnight successes, right? You really need to build that kind of chicken, right? Invisible for everybody, right? So things can then pick up, right?
Yeah. And shameless plug, when we were at FOSDEM, one of the talks that I did, I asked people, how, who has, hundreds of thousands, millions of downloads, but no revenue, no customers.
And we saw a couple like very enthusiastic, like me. Oh my God, this is what I am going through.
They're
right
trying
now.
to monetize it. And so we were talking about building open source businesses, and they're trying to go through that monetization strategy, but it's just not clicking. And one of the funny things is, I think people assume because it's open source, you can build a business around it, or there's lots of downloads. I think there's a lot of open source software that's just not monetizable. Right? Like, I mean, I know companies who have like, oh, we're trying to monetize a library in Python, and it's like, how are you going to do that?
I mean, you have to like think about how much value any small unit of software actually provides to the whole stack. Like, you can have very, very pervasive software that's in, millions and millions of projects, but like, how much value is left pad to me, or, these kinds of things that do one tiny, tiny specific thing in the context of your whole company.
You're right. And I think it's interesting thing, like also in this case, like as you speak about the libraries, right? I think you have to understand there is a sort of like a critical mass of a value, right? What you are getting, right? Which independent on the price gets you to go through all that things you have to do when you're building out contractual relationship, right? Because imagine what you sell here. I want you to sell your library like for 1 cent, right? Well, you know what? It's not meaningful, right? In this case, but you still, if you cannot use it according to, let's say, some open source license, right? That gets all that kind of other other things, right? What you have to do, right? If you are building that into your software, right? And that may restrict the license and you can use your software for, right? And so on and so forth, right? Which is totally not even kind of related to a price, but that, introduces the complexity out there.
Okay. Now,
how does this look?
The look is because he mentioned the L word.
The L word.
License.
Ooh.
And Avi has been arguing with me for forever on licenses, and so I want to get to that in a second. But before I do, I want to go back to your new company, and are there specific companies that you're kind of excited to talk to? Like, is it like mainly infrastructure? Or?
Well, yes. Look, I mean, if you think about that, right, I like to make a difference, right? So that goes into the companies, right, where I can make a difference, right, and that's typically the open source, right, but also the I think the more focus on databases and infrastructure space in general, right? If it's, let's say, well, this is like a little data visualization library, right? Like, frankly, I don't know much about this space, right? Like, and probably I can provide less value than if you are building next distributed database, right?
Yeah. So, out of curiosity, you don't have to tell me who. Has there been any companies or people who you've talked to who they're like, oh, we really want to work with you, but you're like, wow, that's a bad product?
Well, I mean, like in a certain cases, that is the case. But what I would say is, it is not even so much like is a bad product, right? Because I think if you look at their a bad product, many open source projects which have been successful, they started not particularly good, right? Like if you think about this, well, Think about even like a MySQL, which is close to us, right? In the early stage, MySQL was not particularly very good product, right? People call it toy database for a reason, right? You can talk, especially like to PostgreSQL community, you can say, oh my gosh, not even transactions, no subselects, like what the hell is that, right? But then if you get that kind of following, right? If you can find those kind of like a small number of users which are absolutely in awe of what you can offer them, then that is something which can scale, right? And that is what I'm looking for to encourage founders to, hey, you know what? Think about this. As an early stage startup, right? You do not need tomorrow to find 10 million of users, right? You need 100 or 1,000, right? But for those people, you need to be, absolutely best choice, right? So what is that your kind of an X factor, right? Because if you will, right? Or what that is like your advantage, which is like, hey, you know what? We make this product better than anything else on the market, right? And to me, I think many products or founders saying, they often say like, well, you know what? We are doing what product X does, but you know what? We are 5% faster. Nobody gives a shit.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because you mentioned this, like, oh, how do I get 1 million users, or even, and you have to kind of reset the expectations. The majority of, especially in the infrastructure space, in the more successful companies that we look at in the open source space, most of their revenue comes from a very small number of customers. They might have a lot of customers, but there are a lot of really tiny ones with a lot of or a few large ones, and you get almost a 90-10 or an 80-20 split.
Oh, totally. Well, but I think, and even maybe more than different numbers than that, but I think here it's kind of important to understand, right, is what many of those bars may get there, right, because there is like a wide adoption in the ecosystem, right? Because, you can find solution for everything, right? There is a lot of books, you can recruit engineers and so on and so forth, right? And that means what typically their broad ecosystem helps the monetization. Yes, right, there is, of course, let's say some, even in the proprietary software, right? You can say, well, there is this kind of very niche technology, right, which is only used by, 5 companies, which are all kind of shell out gazillion money on that, right? And it works, right? But frankly, that is not the market like I understand so much, right? I think I look in this case as kind of open source through adoption and a freemium model, right, if you will, right, where you will have like much more people using the software for free, right, compared to being buyers.
Okay, shifting gears a little bit. I'm going to even hold off on the licensing thing just a second. For those of you who are watching or listening, just to give you the setup, we are in a glass fishbowl that overlooks a room where they're giving presentations. And, so just outside of this glass window, you can see slides, you can see people presenting. And flashing up on the screen, because I looked up a few minutes ago, was, somebody talking about, yes, we should get more government regulation and funding for open source. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts about, government funded open source, or even more stringent regulations on, open source?
Okay, so like one thing you have to know in this case, right, is what I was born in the Soviet Union, right? And if you were born in Soviet Union, right, you probably will have an attitude what government tend to fuck up anything it touches. Right? So in this case, like that is my protection. And so I'm not a big fan of more regulation in this case, right? And so don't think saying, oh, we want everybody in kind of an open source to do X, Y, and Z, right? I think that is quite misguided, because I think one of the great values of the open source is exactly this kind of permissionless innovation.
Right. I mean, just before we keep going, what would it even mean to regulate open source? I'm not even sure I understand the premise.
Well, okay, so I mean, I guess like even in the EU, there's some laws that you have to like you could be held liable for like
As a
defects.
maintainer?
Well, so this is where there's been some talks on this, and what I'd have to go back and look because I'm not 100% sure. But this is a pretty big deal where it's like there's been a lot of talk about hey, if you have software bug that causes something like the log4j thing, or something like that that is so prevalent and it causes issues, we should be able to say like, yeah, it's on the vendors who created those problems. I don't believe that.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, like there's
Yeah, no, I think that is horrible,
Crazy.
right? And right? I mean, a lot of open source, I think that's like in many lists. Hey, this software is provided with no warranty, right? And use at your own risk, right? And I think in this case, like you have to, in my opinion, recognize the difference between the creators, right, and the vendors, right? So I totally understand when you say, well, the government, we want to make sure the people who provide the products to end users, products to end users, right? Then out there, well, same as you are requested, you to have like a car, certain quality, right, which passes certain tests, right? And if things go bad, you may be liable for that. The same applies to open source, but that is somewhere on you to have a proper contract. Same as you do with the metallic stuff, right? Like, hey, you know what? I have airbags, for example. Somebody is responsible for making sure that is.
Yeah. As soon as you're accepting money, you're accepting some responsibility, some liability for what happens. But I can't even imagine. When I was putting out some of my own projects, like I didn't realize that Adobe was going to be using them, or these bigger companies. They just showed up and said, hey, your shit is broken. You need to fix these things because it's affecting us. I can't imagine if they were coming to me on GitHub and said, hey, we're actually going to be suing you because your shit is broken. Oh my God, can you, I can't even imagine being in that situation. It'd be insane.
Yes, well, I mean, I'm hopefully it's not going to get to that. But again, like, with my, I think that is one of the unfortunate thing about this generation, right? I think is what you look at in this case, like, I think young people, right, because of, like, in many places, right, computer science is taught in school even those days, right? They understand software much better. But in many cases, you're like a lawmakers or from older generations, they only have like a very superficial ideas about the software, internet, and so on. And it scares shit out of me, right? What they can come up with.
Very true.
Yeah, because you're applying people who might not necessarily know the industry, and you're applying it to, an industry that is a bit of a renegade, right? No pun intended, but I don't know. The problem with paying maintainers has long been argued about and talked about.
Yeah.
I don't think that the solution is government open source welfare. Paying maintainers from the government or having the government foot the bill for some of these. I just think that's one of those things that you're going to have a hard time unless the government assumes more control over where projects are steered or going.
Well, but let's say it, right? Government tends to waste a lot of money on various crap, right? And I think probably giving some of that money to open source would provide more value, right, than some other things which are.
But who do you give it to?
That's a great question. It's very unclear, but I would say the answer is someone.
Well, okay. So if can I apply for a grant if I have an open source project and, anybody can go get it? Or is it like something where someone in somebody who's lobbied or even like given money by other people gets to choose, like, you get money, you don't get money?
I mean, I would say that even if the system that is distributing that money is flawed, still better to funnel more money into open source, right?
I don't know. I don't know. Because if it's flawed and you are funneling it to, a very small group of people, that can really skew things as well. And it can make more of a disparate difference between the haves and the have-nots.
Well, I mean, I think the question in this case here is always what alternative, right?
I don't know. I don't have the
we
answer.
compare it to, right? From my standpoint, I am not a big fan of government welfare in this case. But if you're saying, well, you know what, we are going to give those things like waste on various like a proprietary stuff. That is not a good idea, right? And I think, and also one thing that you're saying in the government is grants, right? The other is kind of government more of a leading the way to say, well, you know, we are actually building software for the government needs, right? To make sure what the components what we are using, right, are actually well maintained, right, and providing some funding in this case, right. In this case, that's different, right?
Absolutely.
Right. That is something which is sort of essentially focusing on your government project supply chain instead of, you know, like spending a bunch of money on Oracle, right? We'll just help Larry to get a bigger boat. Right, instead of providing any value to society.
We do see in SCARF's data quite a bit of government organizations, government orgs using packages that are distributed on SCARF. And I feel like if the government even had, let's just take the United States, you know, just saying, yeah, we'll send money to specifically those dependencies. Like, the alternative is they don't do that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess one of the things you said, Peter, though, which is interesting, is if they did want to support these projects, hiring developers that worked on them would probably be an effective strategy.
I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think where Peter's coming from is like, well, no, the government will royally mess it up if they try to do that. Better let the people who actually, you know, are the subject domain experts do it, and then make sure that
contribute versus not. I mean,
well,
I don't know.
I would say from my standpoint, right? One, I think, is what if you have a good approach that the government, right, should embrace open source more, right, as a preferred approach, right? But in this case, you have to understand the open source better, because it looks to me like in many cases there is not much difference between like open source, open core, right, or let's say, you know, the open source, which is kind of a shrink wrapped in a cloud, and through that becomes really proprietary, right, and all that kind of stuff, right? And obviously they're preferring real open source, right, and you know, creating a preference for the vendors, right, which can provide those services, including maintaining those open source projects. That's their opportunity for funding can happen, right? But with actually also like direct benefit to their to the consumers, right? Like, well, and I mean, like by people who use those government services, right, in the end, right, to benefit them.
Did you have a thought?
No, go. No, you look like you were gearing up.
All right. So this is the third or fourth time to this conversation we came back to the licensing situation, and I know you have two diametrically opposing views, so I'd like you to argue about those opposing views.
Oh, so yeah.
I don't know that I'm diametrically opposed. I'm not like a, you know, proprietary software advocate or something like that.
Okay. So, Peter, you have called the BSL license the bullshit license. He is also a new term for the SSPL. Would you like to share that?
Oh, I forgot. I came up with a number of
the super shitty proprietary license.
Yes. Oh, that's yes.
Yeah. The super shitty proprietary license. That's what he considers the SSPL. He sent that to me the other day. And so the question is, and this is a question that Avi and I have been talking about a lot, is does the definition of open source need to expand in order to allow more, would you say, protections? Is that fair to companies? Or
yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah, protections for companies, sure.
Okay. So tell us what you think should happen.
So I think that overall, if you have licenses that get you say 95% of the way towards full open source. So you kind of think of it of open source less as a binary, it is or it isn't, versus something that has a little bit more nuance to it. I would rather see more companies like Mongo, or Elastic versus more companies that are fully proprietary. I think there's value to getting partially the way there. And so I think that it would be great if our open source definitions could somehow account for that kind of thing, because ultimately full open source, while is, I think, the ideal, is just not going to be appropriate for every single company. And so I want us to kind of get towards a point where we are not completely shunning, projects just because they don't get all the way there. Maybe they get most of the way there.
Well, I think for me, there's 2 points here. Like, one is in this case, look, you want should proprietary software exist? Even like a completely proprietary? Yes, of course. Should we allow people for shades of gray? Yes. Right, but the open source, right, was created as something, very specific, right? And I don't think that is a good idea to let people to attempt to redefine that, right, which does not really meet the criteria of open source anymore. And what is most important, also does not provide their value to the consumers, right? What you would expect in open source.
Mm-hmm.
That is my first problem. Now, if you look at me, and I wrote a lot of nice things about folks like Elastic. Is I very much dislike when people are dishonest.
Yes,
right in this case, right, and also. They play the games, because what often happens is now companies, right, they release their stuff as open source, and hey, you know what, to drive adoption game, to get the contributions, to get all this good stuff, right, as long as they reach a critical mass, they say, you know what, thank you, everybody, now things are going to go proprietary, right, and you guys relied on us, right, well, screw you, right? Well, too bad what you just, gave us the contribution, right, for all the copyright, right? That's you lost. That is what I dislike, right? For example, speaking about Elastic, right? Look, there are actually 1,000+ people who wrote some code for Elastic, which they took, and then say no. You cannot get access to that derived work anymore unless you pay the money, right? And we just get all your work for free. Not a very good setup.
I don't think that these arguments are. I think they can both be true, right? Like it's always bad, I think, to just rug pull someone. If you had an agreement in place and then you just kind of alter that agreement without having kind of buy-in from the other side of that, that
well
agreement,
that's right, but I think in this case, in this case, right, of course, a lot of those agreements, they are not really like legal agreements, right? They're sort of
understandings,
sort of an understanding, right? Well, and what I want to also to say, and what I would like to see happen, in my opinion, right? If you look at, if you compare the open source to, let's say, Creative Commons style licenses, right, which you use for other kind of content. The good thing of Creative Commons is that they have a very good definition of a variety of Creative Commons license. Hey, you know what? They allow you this thing, right, to be used for any purpose. For this one, it has to be only non-commercial. Here is there attribution required, and so on and so forth, right? And that understands a very clear definition what that stuff is, right? In open source, we do not really have that. A lot of companies, right, they're using the open source as a marketing, right? Then they're actually not. I myself kind of called in many companies who say like, oh, we're open source. And I'm saying, no, you're not. You're open core, right? Or you are shared source, right? And I actually got like some of them even, nag them enough, right? So they would change, wording on their on the website because I want to make sure, well, what we keep the open source mean, what that's supposed to mean. And I think the interesting thing about the open source, right? I remember speaking to some of the creators of open source term, right? They kind of say, well, you know what, with all that's kind of like open source and kind of freedom ideas of that stuff, right? And now we have been kind of young and naive, right? We did not trademarked the open source term, right? Because that was sort of already given in to that like evil sort of a government for enforcement, right? We wanted that to be shared understanding. And many of them regret that right now because really, well, you can actually use open source and anyway, nobody can do anything legally to use that term, right? Only you may see community look at that and say, well, you know what, it's kind of doesn't look like open source, right?
So I think where we have had the discussion, Avi, is more on like talking about reappropriating the term open source. Like I view Elastic or Mongo in some cases when they use the term open, they still want to be associated with open source. And there's other places that have SSPL that say that they're open source or, open. And it's, trying to change the definition in people's minds of what that term is.
Yes.
When it doesn't necessarily meet the definition.
Right. No, I think that being the argument that I'm trying to make, I think, is completely separate from being disingenuous versus honest. I think the honesty part is always, I think, a requirement, I think, for doing, good business around open source. But you can have so many of those, ideals baked into your company and community while still having some very, very specific and targeted restrictions in your license, for instance. There's a huge difference between, we're going to say we're open source and we're not, versus, okay, well, we're going to specifically protect ourselves, say, from Amazon or something, but in every other way, we're going to behave exactly like an open source company, and maybe we still won't call ourselves open source.
Well, just don't call it open source, right? And that's and that's fine with me.
But I feel like the open source community has a little bit of a culture of, well, if it's not called open source, then I don't care at all, and I want nothing to do with it. And I don't think that's really
well. But I think in this case, what's in my opinion, right? If you look in this case, like when you're speaking about, we are protecting from yourself from Amazon, right? What that comes about is, hey, we want to remove the fundamental freedom for you as a customer, because as a customer, I want a choice, and I want that choice to be maybe working with Amazon, right? If you say, if I would like specifically name in the license that everybody but Amazon is able to use this product, right? Then that means you restrict me as a consumer. What if I want to use Amazon, right, and they want to provide me with a service, they can because of your bullshit license.
Right. Okay.
Right. So and that is, I think, a very clear thing, right? In the open source and not, right? Do you have a freedom, or you have restrictions, right? In this case.
I mean, I think by that argument, then licenses like the AGPL should also be no good.
Well, I in this case, like I would agree to you in a certain extent, right?
Great.
Like, or in this case, in my opinion, right, that is where some open source definition like is a little bit loose, right? And I would like to see more of that defined, right? And I think, like, as I talk in some presentations of mine, saying, hey, a lot of you people don't understand, like really understand, because there is a license, but that's only like one component, right? Because I may have my license, which is open source, but I only have source out there with no build instructions, and I only provide you a build if you're a subscriber. Well, that my
projects that do that.
Well, I've seen the projects which do that, right? Or they provide like think even like MariaDB, right? You cannot download MariaDB enterprise builds, even though it's open source. Well, because of GPL, right, in MySQL, but it's only available if you're a subscriber.
Interesting.
Right, to you, right? So people often do not really understand, particular things, what that mean in open source, right? And again, like what I would like to see, and that is actually, if you think about like some of the projects which, well, I don't think as a commercial organization, Renegade Underdog is set up. I would like some, like a foundation, somebody to pick up some sort of like, kind of clarifying practical open source, right? And maybe having some, simple checklist, right, for different projects, saying, hey, you know what, is there like number of members, like a size of community, right? So I can understand, well, is that practical project for me to use, right? Because there are some other things, like if I'm saying, well, it is a project, maybe kind of it's, even publicly licensed, well, not publicly licensed, but, permissively licensed,
Yes.
and it's, just one person, in this case, uses it, right? Well, that also has another practical applications, right, which may be problematic, right?
Trying to think. I don't have an immediate follow-up to that. I mean, I largely agree with this, and I overall don't think these viewpoints are necessarily in conflict with one another.
So you're not BS zealot, no?
Huh?
You're not BS zealot?
No, not at all. I mean, I think that I really don't like baiting and switching. So I think that if you start with an agreement with your community, then kind of changing that deal is no good. I think that if you start with the BSL, that's totally fine. Like that's a totally reasonable approach for a company to take. But I do think that calling that open source is disingenuous.
Well, yeah, that's right. But I think there is, if you look about the other claims, which BSL folks do, right, which I don't agree with, right? What they open, and I looked at number of BSL projects which has some history. They say, well, you know what, it's good because, you know what, in a few years or something, this product will become open source, right? And so it's almost as good as open source. Well, in reality is, typically the project will become open source past its end of life, right? And at that point, nobody really kind of maintains that. And yes, you can undig that zombie, right, and try to, reanimate it, right? Probably nothing good comes out of that.
Maybe. Overall, though, I would still much rather see lots of BSL projects than lots of closed source proprietary projects by a long shot. Like it's a huge improvement over something that's fully closed off.
I agree with you, right? As long as BSL folks do not try to market them inappropriately.
I agree
right?
with that. Yeah, I agree. Okay, common ground found.
We're building bridges. Well, Peter, I know that you do have a hard stop in a bit here because you have another meeting to go to.
Busy day, yes.
Busy day. So we do appreciate you stopping by the State of
joining
OpenCon. And we do appreciate talking to you, and hopefully you have a great rest of your day.
Yes, thank you.